Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to episode 57 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast with me, Rory Lees-Oakes, and as always, my colleague in the heuristic world, Mr. Ken Kelly.
It's good to be here, especially in the heuristic world. I don't know what that is, but I'm hoping you're going to tell me, Rory. What's a heuristic world?
It's heuristics is the philosophy of logic. So
well,
it's a philosophical position, and it leads us nicely onto the theory, Ken, as we move through this podcast.
Yes, and a great episode that we have as well. We're going to be kicking off having a chat about implicit and explicit in counselling. We're going into theory with Rory, where we're going to be looking at existentialism, and we're going to be delving deep today. And then we're going to finish off speaking about the person-centered modality and kind of what's that really about, and is there any science that underpins the person-centered modality in counselling? But starting off episode 57 in a logical way. Was it holistic? Well, not holistic. Heuristic. I've got to write these things down, Rory. And looking at implicit and explicit in counselling. And this, of course, comes from our Facebook group. Will you share what came in there, Rory?
Okay, well, it actually came from an email, so I can't say who it's from because, of course, our emails are confidential. But what we do know is there's an awarding body called CPCAB, a well-known and, by all accounts, very reputable awarding body. And one of the things they ask students for is the difference between implicit and explicit. And the reason they ask is because, like a lot of awarding bodies, there's a course suite. You start at level 2 and you work your way through the levels. And what they're trying to differentiate between this is what you can do as someone who has counselling skills and what a counsellor does. So I'm going to expand on that. Implicit and explicit, and I'm going to kind of expand those words, imply and explain. Okay, so if you're a support worker, as I was for a number of years, your service users would explain what the problem was and you would try to work with them, but you'd use counselling skills. You wouldn't be a counsellor. Yeah, you wouldn't be kind of trying to open a process up and saying, I'm aware that when you tell me your housing benefit hasn't come through, you look sad. Yeah. What you would say is, I'm aware you've told me your housing benefit hasn't come through, so let's see what we could do about it. Because as a helper using counselling skills, that's what you'd be doing. So that's when someone explains something and you're trying to help them. And that fits really neatly into counselling skills. A lot of people take counselling skills courses and then go off and use it in a variety of work: police officers, medics, lawyers, nurses, support workers, hairdressers. I've had all sorts of people through the years who've just gone away with a level 3 and used the skills in their own work setting where they're using the skills to help facilitate another outcome. So that's explicit. It's explicit. Now, implicit is implied. When somebody implies something. So I'll give you an example of that in the therapy room. I'm making this scenario up. Client comes in and says, how are things? And they go, oh, I'm really happy today. I finally left that job and that I really, really hate it. I'm so happy about it. So they're explaining what's going on. But then you notice that they're banging their fist on the chair. So what are they implying? And a therapist would say, I hear that you're saying that you're happy about leaving your job, but I noticed that when you say that, you're banging your fist on the chair.
Like it.
And what's happening is that you're starting a process off. And that is what you don't do if you're using counselling skills. You don't start a process off because it's unethical to counsel someone, who's come from something else. Someone comes to see Rory about housing benefit, as I used to do when I was a support worker. What could be worse? They talk about housing benefit, and I'm saying, you look sad when you tell me that. And then they tell me the life story. And before long, we started a counselling session when what I'm really employed to do is help try and get their claim sorted out.
Yeah.
And it's unethical because they're not going to come back again the next week and see me. My job isn't a counsellor. It was a housing advice worker, housing advice officer at the time. So that is explicit. They're explaining something and using your skills to facilitate that. Implicit is where you're starting the process off. And CPCAB show a differentiation in their course structure. So as you move through the courses, you have to show in your criteria what the implicit was. And there's no better way, I don't think, in observing nonverbal communication.
Love it. Yeah.
Because it's a good way of evidencing. I noticed my clients, it could be a role play if you're doing the criteria on a role play. I noticed my client was looking down when they told me, or they were looking uncomfortable, or they started to cry. That's the implicit. That's when you're working with not what they're saying, but what they're implying. Not what they're explaining, but what they're implying. So there we go. Explicit and implicit.
It's almost that music behind the words, isn't it? It's the words explain, but the music behind the words, that is implicit. It implies where the person may be. And as you were explaining it to me, it seems like explicit is active listening, where you can take your skills and actively really show that person that you're really there listening to what they're saying, but you're not looking to dig into any emotion. You're not looking to go any deeper, just to listen to them, really. And when you were speaking about implicit, it's almost, if we look to person-centered, we talk about maybe working with the incongruence. That would be the implicit, the incongruence. The banging of the hand is showing the incongruence behind what words may be said. And that is therapeutic. And there's the big difference for me, is that the one is not necessarily therapeutic. Explicit is not therapeutic. Implicit would be therapeutic.
Beautifully put, Ken. Beautifully put, absolutely. And who better to explain that than someone who's written a book on counselling skills? So there you go. You put it far better than me, Ken. Brilliant.
Well, it's a great question, and thank you very much for that email. And of course, if you have a question or a topic you want to bring up for Rory and I to discuss, debate, you can do so by sending an email, if you wish to rory@counsellingtutor.com, because Rory is our academic director. He handles all the content and that we put out. And otherwise, you can go to our Facebook page, which is, go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor. We're the one at the top with thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people. It was over 14,000 last time I looked. Come and knock on the door. We'll let you in and come and join in the discussion with students of counselling from all around the world. We've got some qualified counsellors in there as well, and lots of tutors as well that hang out and share their advice and guidance. We'd love to hear from you. And of course, I would love to hear from you, Rory, because you're going to be doing Theory with Rory today, Existentialism. And we spoke about this only recently on the podcast. We kind of kicked the ball around a bit, but it is based in theory, and you're going to be taking more of a theoretical look at this.
Yes, we're going to have a look at existentialism because it forms the basis of a lot of therapies. Existential therapy, clearly. Person-centered therapy. Carl Rogers was really influenced by Soren Kierkegaard, who was probably the first existentialist. And also talking to friends in the TA community, as I have recently at a conference, they talk a lot about existential life positions. And I think having a handle on existentialism is really useful. And I'm going to give an example of existentialism from Alice in Wonderland. So there you have it.
Well, I live in Cheshire, just down the road from Lewis Carroll, where he was born. So I really look forward to that. So without any further ado, it's Theory with Rory.
Counselling Theory with Rory Lees-Oakes.
In Theory with Rory today, we're going to take a little bit of a diversion from the path of counselling theory and visit philosophy, and one particular philosophy which really connects a lot of theories together and gives its name to one particular theory, existential therapy. But what is existentialism and what does it mean? So I'm going to look at that. But before we look at that, I'd like you to come with me for a trip to my kitchen where I brew up, the colloquialism I use for making a cup of tea. And the other day I was brewing up, making a cup of tea, and I opened the cutlery drawer to get a teaspoon out, and in it was a cheese knife. And for those of you who are not familiar with a cheese knife, it's effectively a knife, and it's curled up at the end 45 degrees, so the blade takes a 45-degree turn, and at the end it has 2 points on. and a V in the middle. And the idea is that you could cut your cheese with one hand using the blade of the knife, then niftily turn the knife over, stab the points of the knife into the cheese, and then transport the cheese from where the cheese is to either another plate or your bread. And it struck me that the cheese knife only existed because someone invented it. In other words, at some point, someone got fed up of using a knife and fork to cut cheese, or maybe just a knife, and decided that another device was useful. They may have drawn a picture of it. They may have had some prototypes. But one thing we know for certain, the knife did not exist before the thought of its existing took place. It had to be created. And in existential ideas, we sometimes call that essence precedes existence. In other words, a thought of something precedes something existing. Someone had to invent the knife before they made it. So why is that important? Well, essence precedes existence was the thinking that humanity had about the human condition for thousands of years. Even Plato and Socrates talked about people having an essence, human beings having an essence, some kind of built-in purpose. And through the years, religions have kind of taken the place of the philosophers, and up till the 1940s, it was believed that God created human beings, and they created with an essence, and then that essence was lived out in the way they existed in their lives. But at the end of the Second World War, intellectual thinking shifted. And the reason it shifted was because of the horrors of the concentration camps and the Holocaust. It questioned a lot of ideas of the human condition, including if people were good, what drove people to this kind of barbarity to their fellow human beings. But one particular theorist, Jean-Paul Sartre, a French philosopher, decided he was going to change or think about the way that people existed. And as I said earlier, essence precedes existence. He switched that round. In other words, he said existence precedes essence. And the whole idea of existentialism is that we're born to a world that has no meaning, and we make our own meanings. In other words, we turn up in the world and we have to kind of fit in the best we can. And one of the difficulties that Sartre talked about was that man was free. If they're free from religious thought, they can be anything they want to be. They're not guided by religious moral principles. But then that leaves a gap. And that gap is, what do you exchange it for to live a reasonable life? And that's where Sartre believed anxiety came from. The fact that we had to find our own meaning in life, and that anxiety went hand in hand with being an existentialist, because there was no clear plan, there was no grand scheme that one could rely on or fall back on. In fact, quite the opposite. You were out there on your own and you had to make sense of it. So how does this really link with modern day therapies? Well, I've been practicing for quite a few years, and one of the things that I've noticed is that people in therapy try to make sense of their life. It could be bereavement, living without a loved one. It could be loss of health. It could be loss of innocence if someone had been abused as a child. But all of these are very existential positions, because when people come to therapy, they're trying to make sense of their lives in sometimes very senseless situations. Things like natural disasters or terrorist bombing outrages will leave people asking the fundamental questions: why me? Why did it happen to me? And we hear this so much. And part of a therapist's work is to work with the meanings clients give. And it wasn't lost on certainly one theorist, Carl Rogers, who we know studied the work of a philosopher called Soren Kierkegaard, and he was a theist existentialist. So effectively, theists believe that the world is created, and then whoever created it kind of moves on. And they refute what's called teleological ideas. And teleological ideas are the ideas that the universe is made by a creator, like a watch with cogs. There is no intelligent design in teleology. And we know that Rogers took a lot of Kierkegaard's ideas, certainly around anxiety, and built them into the model that would become person-centered therapy. So the next time you work with a client who is asking questions, why is this happening to me? I really don't understand what's happened. Really, they are engaging in existential conversation with themselves. They are trying to make sense of a world that sometimes is senseless.
Thank you very much for that, Rory. And being a Cheshire lad myself, that reference to the Cheshire Cat, very much appreciated. Thank you for that. And of course, if you want to get Rory's super handout, you can do that by going to counsellingtutor.com. That is our mother website, and that's 2 L's in counselling, the UK spelling. Click on the homepage. You can just click on podcasts. Go to episode 57. That's today's episode. And all of the show notes are there, including Rory's handout. And of course, if you're a member of the Counselling Study Resource, or you're a member of the Handouts Vault, well, that handout is already available for you because it has been added to the Handouts Vault. But great theory on existentialism. Thank you very much. And I guess moving on, you spoke about Carl Rogers going into theory with Rory and him being influenced. And we're now going to be delving a little bit deeper into person-centered modality. And this is linked into a Facebook comment that was posted, Rory.
Yes, it was. And we're always grateful to those of you who give us our material for the podcast. And we're grateful today to Paul Keys, who posted, and he says, "Hi, folks. I'm a level 3 student at the moment. Have been listening to the podcast. So hi, Paul. And things. I know I might be too far ahead of myself, but I'm struggling to understand the science behind how the counsellor helps the client in person-centred counselling with just reflections on the core conditions, as ultimately the client helps themselves through self-disclosure and opening up. Is there a simple explanation for it? As I've had CBT and at the time was unaware of the process. Question mark. Well, Paul, we're going to try and help you out with this, aren't we, Ken?
We are indeed. And it's a familiar territory, I guess, for myself. I work in a person-centered way, so it's like getting into a warm bath for me, Rory. Looking forward to this chat.
Yeah, it's a bit of a warm bath with extra bath bombs, yeah. Well, here's the thing, Paul. There is a science behind person-centered therapy. Carl Rogers was a scientist. He was a clinician. He did a lot of research, and his research was on listening to literally hundreds, if not thousands, of tape recording interviews, as he called them, between students and clients, and picking up kind of traits that clients would present and how the therapist would work with that, themes. And basically, in a nutshell, person-centered therapy realizes and kind of assumes that people have things on their worried minds that they can't talk to anybody else about without judgment and without somebody saying, well, what you should do is this, should, musts and have tos, and advice. So in person-centered therapy, the idea is that you come into a confidential environment, that you're using those facilitative conditions, you sometimes refer to as the core conditions, of empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard. The client feels they're able to be themselves, something that they can't be maybe in other relationships. And as such, they begin to develop their ability to be who they are. Now, I have to say, what we're looking at here is metaphysics. And it's the kind of a bit of a wedge. It's a bit like cheese, if you like. You know, metaphysics at one end is things like counselling, where it's quite difficult to get scientific evidence. It's not like gravity, where you can drop a ball and it falls to the ground every single time. But there are ways of measuring it, and it is seen as a reliable model. Right at the other end of the metaphysical scale, you have things like ghosts. And, you know, that is, again, harder to measure, but it is metaphysics. So first lesson to take away from here, Paul, is that psychology, and indeed counselling, isn't an exact science. There's not an overall paradigm. So there's not one agreement, unlike gravity. And the second is it actually works. There is something, I think, about trusting the process, Ken.
Oh yeah, and there's a famous saying out there called "trust the process," and it's often quoted when relating to person-centered therapy. And I think back to my own days as a student. I remember being really interested in the theory, and I enjoyed looking at the comparative theories and looking at REBT or CBT, and looking at transactional analysis, and then comparing that to person-centered. And I felt at the time while I was studying it that there seemed to be so much more meat on the bone of the behavioral model and the psychoanalytical model, and that the person-centered was kind of, as the question kind of implies, where's the science that underpins this? And I remember going into placement, feeling this, but doing what I needed to do and working in a person-centered way as I was called for by my course, by my supervisor, and by my awarding body for my studies. But I remember very clearly taking to supervision my mistrust of this process and saying, I don't get it. I don't understand how I can just sit there and reflect back and be with this person, how they're going to find their way. And my supervisor at the time shared with me about patience and about believing and trusting that the client will find their way, as is outlined in the theory written by Carl Rogers. And I'm very glad to say that thousands of client contact hours later, I am now on a podcast talking about this subject, and there was a massive transformation that happened in front of my very own eyes by a client, and not, I guess, not from anything I did, because I was there with them and they found their own way. And I'm grateful of the guidance and that I had at the time to be able to witness that. I now believe in the process, and wow, it's magical in a way, spiritual in a way. Even Rogers, towards the end of his time, speaks of it as almost being a physical transformation. It's spoken about as self-actualization, which is Maslow, if I remember correctly, derived from there. And I just hope, Paul, that you will get to see it and experience it with a client.
Yes, and before we kind of finish on this topic, let me draw a parallel. Have a listen to a choir, and a choir sings maybe your favourite song, and there is some science behind it. We can measure the octaves, we can measure the sound, the decibel level. We can even measure the heartbeats of each individual choir member. And I've just recently learned that when people sing in a choir, their heartbeats start to match each other, which is kind of interesting. But really, is that important when you're sitting listening to that wonderful singing and it becomes part of you? Because counselling is as much a way of being as it is a way of doing.
Oh, I do like that, specifically when you're speaking person-centered counselling, and of course referring right back to that book. Is it what is it you say, Rory? A seminal piece of work, A Way of Being, by Carl Rogers. Unbelievable and well worth a read. I read Carl Rogers' other works and I found them sometimes difficult to get through, but A Way of Being was just beautiful in all aspects. And, you can't overestimate a threat-free environment. And that's what we bring as person-centered counsellors, is we give a threat-free environment where that client can come and be who they really are. Very often they will have been judged in their life, or at least feel that they're judged. They will be acting to an external locus of evaluation, in other words, living their lives and behaving for the benefit of others, because if I do this, then they're going to think this of me. And with that unconditional positive regard, that takes that away, and they are in a threat-free environment where you can see sometimes in the process the client will put something in that they feel is a bit risky. Will I be accepted if I say this? And they'll throw it in, and they are accepted. And slowly they open up, as Schilling said, like the flower, slowly opening up and showing that inner beauty. But it's about patience, and it's about just being there and letting them go at their pace and not having an expectation, because some clients, maybe it won't be their time to open up and they may leave without. But that's the journey, and that's, I guess, the beauty of person-centered therapy.
Absolutely. And what a way to end this podcast. We've covered implicit and explicit. We've looked at existentialism and been down the rabbit hole with Alice in Wonderland.
To Cheshire.
The Cheshire cat that lives near Ken, apparently.
It does.
It does, yeah. And also we've answered Paul Key's question on what person-centered therapy is. Fantastic episode. We thank you all for listening. And as always, from me, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take care. If you enjoy the topics and handouts here on the Counselling Tutor Podcast, then you will love the Counselling Study Resource. CSR was built by myself, Ken, and Rory Leesoaks to give you the support you need during your counselling studies. So get access to the world's most comprehensive collection of resources aimed at supporting you in your journey to become a counsellor. Take the stress out of your studies by visiting counsellingtutor.com/CSR. That's counsellingtutor.com/CSR.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.